There we go. And so we are ready to jump into our new session as part of our ongoing masterclass series. Welcome, everybody. If you have not joined us previously, our masterclass series has received some wonderful feedback from singers. In fact, this past one was a fabulous session with composer Sarah Cortell. Of course, we've spent some time with Jared Pegankopf at Chanticleer, and Aaron Freeman with the City Choir of Washington and Richmond Ballet, and of course, Zaina Azam, the Poet Laureate from the City of Alexandria. And just like tonight's presentation, all of our master classes are recorded, and so you can register even after the fact and gain access to the recordings if you would like to take in any of the previous master classes. But we are here tonight with Michael C. Patterson, and Michael is going to present a masterclass called The Music of the Mind. And so I would love to read to you Michael's bio and introduce Michael to you. I'll spotlight him in just a moment. But here's a bit of information about Michael to get us going this evening. Michael C. Patterson is a writer, educator, and speaker who focuses on the art and science of successful longevity. Explores how mind and brain can be cultivated to promote living long and living well. Michael's first career was in theater. He acted, directed, and helped found the Bear Republic Theater in Santa Cruz, California. While in Santa Cruz, Michael helped establish a chapter of the Gray Panthers and produced and directed an original play about aging called Wrinkles. He then developed a career in public television, first at WNET in New York, and then with PBS in Washington, D.C. While at PBS, Michael helped develop the PBS Ready to Learn service that provided parents with tools to leverage the educational value of PBS children's programming. He also developed early digital platforms that gave rise to the PBS Kids channel and the PBS Lifelong Learning channel. Michael became more deeply involved with the topic of successful aging when he joined AARP. Michael worked with the National Retired Teachers Association at AARP and developed the award-winning Staying Sharp Brain Health program, which brought him into contact with the top neuroscientists in the country. While at AARP, Michael had the opportunity to fund completion of Dr. Gene Cohen's seminal research establishing the health benefits of engagement with the arts. Dr. Cohen invited Michael to serve on the board of directors of the newly formed National Center for Creative Aging, where he founded and ran the research committee. In 2009, Michael and a colleague established MINDRAMP Consulting, which developed evidence-based programs and services to promote healthy brains and sharp minds. Michael now writes a regular column on aging and the brain for Third Act magazine, produces and hosts the MINDRAMP podcast, and is writing a book on how to manage our minds to promote happiness and fulfillment as we age. Certainly all things that are very relevant to the work that we do here at Encore Creativity. And so I'm so pleased to introduce to you Michael C. Patterson, CEO of MINDRAMP. Michael, welcome to our masterclass series. Oh, you fell victim to Michael, you're muted still.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, we can hear you. I'm going to spotlight you so that everyone can see.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm honored to be here. Thank you, both Brian and Joshua. Let me dive into this because I have a lot of material to go and just always hopeful that the slides will actually behave the way we want them to behave. Thank you for reading that whole introduction. You really covered most of what I wanted to cover in this slide. One point about the work that I did with the Staying Sharp program at AARP, this put me into contact with over 150 neuroscientists. I'm not a neuroscientist myself, but I got to talk to 150 neuroscientists, and one of the things I did was create moderated discussions around the country where we had these neuroscientists essentially answer two basic questions in plain language, not in science speak. Why does the brain get compromised as we get older, in some of us at any rate? And two, what can we do about it? And perhaps not unsurprisingly, when you speak to 150 different neuroscientists, you get 150 different answers. I took it on as my job to be the generalist, to pull together all of the stories that these specialists had of their particular areas and pull it into a coherent narrative. So that's what I'm going to try and share with you today, is that narrative about how we can effectively prevent cognitive decline and keep our brains healthy, and also how we can manage our minds to be more fulfilled. As Brian told you, I had the opportunity to, while I was at AARP, to fund the seminal research that Gene Cohen, who's pictured here, did the first real research that showed that professional artists working with older adults could improve older adults' health and mood. And I don't think you mentioned this, but one of the groups that was studied was Encore Chorale, which is the predecessor of Encore Creativity. And really the best data that Gene was able to collect came from Encore Chorale, and which was led by Gene Kelly at the time. He also got me involved in the whole creative aging movement, which I was very happy about. When I left Staying Sharp, I started MINDRAMP with a colleague of mine, Roger Anionson, and we wanted to continue to monitor the research and figure out how could we explain the science to people in ways that they could actually use. As Brian was saying, our mission throughout in MINDRAMP was helping people to live long and to live well. I coined this term qualongevity, because saying every time that we wanted to promote longevity within the context of quality of life was a bit of a mouthful. So qualongevity, I think we all want to live longer. We want more years, but we don't want those years to be filled with pain or filled with, debility. What we want is extra years that are filled with quality of life. So how do we do that? We have these incredibly nimble bodies and nimble minds, the human being does. So how do we keep our bodies and our brains nimble, brain health, and how do we also keep our minds as nimble as possible, which is really the mental management side of things. So the core topics that I want to address today, I want to say a few words about some ideas about the purpose and the power of music. Then I want to talk about brain health, my ideas about how to keep your brain healthy, and as best we can, bring in some ideas about how music helps with that. And I'm going to ask for your help, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about this when we get to the Q&A. And then finally, talk about mental management. How can we manage our minds to promote well-being, and how can music help us with that? So, without further ado, let me start talking about the purpose and power of music. When I worked with the National Center for Creative Aging, this was professional artists who worked with older adults doing music, visual arts, dance, and so on. And all of these organizations were constantly looking for funding, constantly looking for support. And one of the obstacles that they always ran into is that I think funders and people in power would sort of think, well, music is nice, I love what you're doing, but there are some really important things that we have to fund. So it's like music didn't quite always fit into this super important category. It's a luxury item, not a necessity. Renee Fleming, the opera singer who is now involved in the neuro arts program, which we'll talk about later, had the same point. She said, excuse me, I got to move something that is in my way here. I'm not able to get it. Come on. Well, anyway, she said the problem is that for far too long, the arts have been dismissed as soft, nice to have, not serious, and not worthy of institutional investment in the realm of health. So I did a lot of thinking about this when I was working with the research committee, and there were two ideas which I think help reframe the topic in a useful way. The first one was suggested by Semir Zeki, who is considered by some to be the father of neuroaesthetics. Now I see that I misspelled neuroaesthetics. Should be N-E-U-R. I'm paraphrasing because I don't have his actual quote, but in essence, he said, ask not the purpose of music, ask the purpose of sound. And I think when you think about sound, then, sound is much more fundamental to our well-being and is somehow easier for people to hear. We have this nimble vocal apparatus, this innate ability to produce high complex forms of sound, including language and music. And we have that capacity because it helps us to survive and thrive in a complex environment, particularly in the soundscape that we live in. We have our landscape, but we also have our soundscape. We also have an equally nimble auditory brain that helps us to make sense of the world through sound. And I think when you frame things this way, it begins to get a little bit more at why music is fundamental to who we are and fundamental to our survival. The second key idea is that music is organized sound. So we play with the organization of sound through language, but also through music. And it's through play that we explore our capabilities. We explore our inherent abilities to do what we can do as human beings, and we also improve that capacity. So music being organized sound, and the fact that it's I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. It's through playing with sound that we exercise our capacity to make sound better and to hear things better, both being able to use sound in a productive way and being able to hear sound in a productive way are very fundamental to our survival and our ability to thrive. So where does the power of music come from? Again, where another concept is music is organized energy. When you think about it, sound is just this pulsing of sound waves. It's energy that comes into our ear as a pulsation of energy. It wiggles the eardrum, it tickles the little hairs, it makes all the little mechanisms in our ear vibrate. That gets turned into electrical impulses, electrical energy that runs through our brain cells. That gets turned into chemical energy that jumps from one brain cell to the other. All of these different signals and different energies can energize the stimulation of hormones, they can change the expression of our genes, and they can structure the way that our brain operates. There's a fascinating book actually, he has two fascinating books on the plasticity of the brain. This is Norman Doidge. He is a Canadian neuroscientist. His first book was called The Brain That Changes, and it described the process of science understanding for the first time that the brain really is incredibly malleable and incredibly responsive to what happens in the environment. His second book, The Brain That Changes Itself, looked at really innovative ways that people were using this power of putting energy into the brain to manipulate the plasticity of the brain in positive ways. And he made the point, particularly if you're trying to revive a brain that is struggling, any form of energy, whether that's light or sound or vibration or movement or thought, sound in particular can wake up brain cells that have become dormant. It can stimulate them and bring them back to life. Once they're brought back to life, the type of sound that you produce, the way that it's modulated, can then also modulate the nerve cells and make them more flexible. Further, once you have those two steps established, by practice and by getting very more specific about the type of practice that you do, for example, paying attention to the timbre and the pitch, getting much more acute awareness of all of those things, you can then begin to neurodifferentiate. So the brain gets stronger. You are exerting positive plastic stimulation on the brain using music as energy. So just some initial thoughts to sort of get you thinking about music and how it could possibly relate to brain health and to mental management. So once again, music is organized sound. Sound is energy. Energy is power, power that has the ability to change the plastic nature of your brain. And since music is organized energy, we can manipulate the way that we change and shape our brain. So now I'm going to move into brain health. Maybe take a moment to stand up and shake yourself out if you need to get going on this. I think Joshua asked me in particular to say, what is brain health? What do I mean by brain health when we're talking about this? And from my point of view, the way I look at brain health is that it involves the structural integrity of the body and brain. I take a very much of a preventive point of view, and a preventive approach, and we want to look at the resistance. We want our bodies and brains to be resistant to disease. We want them to be resilient so that they can repair themselves when they do get damaged. And we want to build brain and cognitive reserve. And I'll explain a little bit about what all of that means. Whenever I talk about the brain, I mean the brain and the body. Sometimes I'll say brain and body. Sometimes I'll just say brain. But I always mean the brain and body, because you can't you can't disconnect brain and body. They are intimately connected all the way down from the brain, the central nervous system that runs down our spine, to the peripheral nervous system, runs out to to the ends of our arms and our legs. It's all connected in a flow, a back and forth flow of communication. We also have to make sure that, we need to make sure that all of that is structurally sound. And that includes our circulatory system, our skeletal system, our endocrine system. You'll hear neuroscientists frequently saying that what's good for the heart is good for the brain. And that's because if you're not getting enough blood flow up into the brain, you're actually starving the brain. So if your blood vessels are getting, built up with plaque and you can't get as much blood up into the brain will suffer. Even the digestive system is connected to the brain. We're hearing more and more about how you need to feed your gut biome, all of the diverse species of bacteria that live in our gut have to be fed well so that they can, thrive. If they don't, there's a whole process that goes up into the brain and causes both mood changes and physical and, sort of medical changes. So we need to make sure that the structural body and brain are doing well and are resistant to disease and injury, and resilient in the sense that they can repair themselves if they have been injured or if we get sick. brain reserve and cognitive reserve are two very important points when we're talking about brain health. They essentially refer to the same thing. Because the brain is so plastic, the brain will compensate if some neurons and nerve cells get damaged. Neighboring nerve cells can pick up the activity and sort of cover for them. So the more brain cells that you have, the more healthy brain cells that you have, the better able you are to compensate if something goes wrong. That's called brain reserve. Cognitive reserve refers to a similar thing, but it's more like if you have more and more thinking strategies, if healthy ways of thinking about what you're doing, then if something gets compromised, you have more strategies that you can use to solve problems and get things done. So brain reserve and cognitive reserve, we want to fill our brains, make sure that we're keeping all of our nerve cells, all of the different functional modules of our brain and the connectivity in our brain as robust as possible so that it's protective as we get older and as we sometimes begin to feel the ravages of old age and decline, or if we begin to get sick. So, as I was saying earlier, all of the different neuroscientists tend to specialize and have their own particular things that they think are most important to keep the brain healthy. Or some scientists have a particular hypothesis that they follow, and they get sort of channeled into that particular hypothesis and only see that. I tried to see the big picture, and I also had to try to find some way of organizing all of the material that was coming in, all of the research. So I started putting the research into individual buckets. First, we had 6, I think it was. We expanded it to 8, and I called them the 8 behavioral roots of brain health. And as you can see, there's physical exercise, mental stimulation, social engagement, stress management, sleep, diet, nutrition, environmental factors, and medical care. This should not be surprising to you. Back when I started this 15 years ago, people weren't talking about these things as much. Now it's become pretty much common knowledge. Everything that you read will talk about at least some of these. I want to tell you some of the how to work with these behavioral areas. Oh, I should point out, Brian has put a handout in the chat area. If you want to go to the chat area, you can click on that and it'll download. You can either, if you can download it now and access it, that's great. But if you can't, it's a reference that you can have later. I name each of the 8 behavioral roots and a little bit about the risk factors and a little bit about the protective factors. Now, that's an important point on each of these. With all of these different behavioral roots, there are certain activities that you can do that put you at greater risk for cognitive decline and for dementia. There are other activities that you can do that are actually protective and make your brain stronger and more resilient. So the obvious strategy is to lower the risks and increase the protections. What this does is minimize negative brain plasticity, because plasticity works both ways. Your brain will change. If you don't do anything of the good stuff, it can get worse and worse and worse. If you keep doing the good stuff, then you can stimulate positive brain plasticity, increase that brain reserve. We developed this concept of the rule of the 4 C's. And essentially, we found the evidence was showing us that any brain health intervention that adhered to these 4 C's was a lot more successful. Something that didn't adhere to these was not terribly successful. So causes, combinatorial, customized, and continual. And I use an analogy sometimes of a sinking boat to talk about these. If you're in a boat, and you suddenly realize it's sinking, and you look around, why is it sinking? Oh, it's filling up with water. And then you start bailing out the water. Well, that's not going to help you, because you're focusing on the symptoms. Bailing the water, the real cause of the fact that the boat is sinking is that there are holes in the hull. Well, let's say 8 holes, because there are 8 behavioral roots, 8 holes in the hull. So you have to get to the root cause of the problem, and then you have to plug the hole. And it doesn't do any good to plug one hole. That's not going to do you any good if you don't address the other ones. So you have to do it in a combinatorial. You have to plug all of the holes and make sure that they're not leaking. It's the same thing with the behavioral roots. Each one of them has to be addressed in order for you to be fully protected. It also has to be customized. Every brain is different. And the longer you live, the more different your brain becomes. So one size fits all interventions are not going to work. You have to customize what's going on to your particular needs, your particular brain, your particular circumstances. The interventions also have to be continual. You can't, for example, say, oh, I'm going to eat well next week, and then after that, I'm going to go back to eating, processed foods and fast foods. That doesn't work. You have to make it a part of your lifestyle. You can't exercise vigorously for 1 week and then figure you've got it solved. You have to make physical exercise and movement a part of your weekly routines. So with that context, I want to go through each of these rather quickly, kind of a romp through it. And as we go through, I want to ask you to join me in thinking about how does your experience with music, how does your experience with the Encore Chorale, for those of you who are participating in the chorale, Encore Creativity, sorry, how does that help with stimulating the protective side of these activities? So let's start with physical exercise. I'm just going to stay on this one slide while I go through all of them. Physical exercise, the basic risk factor is a sedentary lifestyle. It's not moving. Modern life is so comfort-based that we just don't move the way we were designed to move, and that has a negative impact on us. Any kind of movement is beneficial, is a protective factor, but more specifically, you need to get aerobic exercise, where you're running around and breathing hard and getting up a sweat. You need to strengthen your body, all of your body. And when you're thinking about music, it's not just your big motor, big muscles necessarily, but also the little muscles of your lips, the little muscles of your tongue, your larynx. When you're singing, they need to be exercised. And, if you don't exercise them, you're not going to articulate as well. You also need to remain flexible. You have to keep stretching. You want to work on balance, and you want to work on posture. Alignment is very important, because if you're aligned, everything sort of falls into place. You're not stressing your muscles. So how does music get you to exercise more, get you to move more? How does doing your music sort of stimulate all those different kinds of music? And when we get to the Q&A, I would love to hear some of your thoughts on this. Mental stimulation is very much the same thing. It's this use it or lose it idea. If you are putting energy into the system and stimulating your brain, then it will remain more active. If you are not stimulating your brain, then your brain will atrophy. We talk about seeking mental activity that is novel, challenging, complex, and meaningful. Meaningful activities are important because it gauges the whole emotional part of your brain and your body. Doing something like Sudoku may exercise one part of your brain, but it also, whether you do it or not doesn't really matter. Whereas if you're doing some volunteering for some good cause, or you're engaged in doing rehearsals because you're going to give a performance, then that means something and it's much more powerful. A lot of robust information or research on the value of social engagement. The risk factors are, obviously there are toxic relationships. You don't want a toxic relationship. Excuse me. Social rejection is very painful and very damaging to us. It hurts just as much as if we were cut with a knife. And loneliness is very damaging to our well-being and to our physical self. So on the flip side, any kind of engagement that makes you feel welcome, makes you feel part of something larger, prevents you from being lonely, is beneficial. I would submit that participating in organized, arts activities like singing are perfect for this type of thing. In addition to getting you off your butt, out of your room, out to wherever the rehearsal is, that's great. But also I was talking about the fine motor control, but also the engagement in all these different ways. A lot of what we're talking about is related to stress management. We say management, not reduction or removal, because stress is a part of our lives. We can't get rid of it, but we can manage our stress. There's good stress and there's bad stress. We are evolved to have a stress response because it's protective. When something is threatening, we need to get stressed out so that we can deal with it. And also stress in this acute stress, this short-term stress, is motivating. When there's some interruption of the homeostatic balance in our body or brain, like if we're low on blood sugar, we feel stressed and we feel hungry because we need to eat. So it motivates us to do the things that we need to do to stay healthy. Excuse me. The dangerous kind of stress is the chronic stress that never goes away. The cortisol and the adrenaline that are expressed in order to, when you're feeling this fight or flight activity, in chronic stress, it's always there and it's becomes toxic instead of being helpful. So I'd be curious to know from your point of view whether you find singing as a stress reduction mechanism. I mean, it's certainly used that way in medicine. I wonder if you have experience with that. Sleep, the connection with music gets a little bit more tenuous. The risk factors are obviously if you don't get enough sleep, if you don't get quality sleep, very bad for you. We need to sleep. We need REM sleep, which is rapid eye movement sleep when you're dreaming, to consolidate memories, to sort through the facts of what we've had. We need deep sleep because it's during deep sleep that our brain repairs itself and revives itself. Excuse me. And during deep sleep is also when the brain flushes out all of the metabolic waste materials that have accumulated during the day. So if you're not getting enough sleep, you're not getting all of this repair. Excuse me. So the question then is, do you use music to help you get to sleep? I can certainly see that happen. I would love to hear, individual experiences. It seems like sleep can have this calming effect, which would make sleeping easier. Diet and nutrition, I have no idea in terms of music. If you have any ideas, let me know. Does good music encourage you to eat a Mediterranean diet, to eat a plant-based diet? I don't know. Does it encourage you to avoid processed foods and bad fats? Possibly. If you have any ideas, let me know. Environmental factors, the risks are an impoverished environment. And, that's risky because of all the things we've been talking about. If you don't have an opportunity to get physical exercise, to be mentally stimulated, to have social engagement, if you live in a stressful environment, all of these, if you can't get enough sleep, that's an impoverished environment. The flip side, obviously, is an enriched environment where you do have access to all of these things that are helpful. And there, I think the connection with music is pretty obvious. Music is a great way to enrich our environment. We've even gotten to the point where we carry around our own little soundtracks. We have our iPhones and our earbuds, and we can, play music to change our moods wherever we are. So medical care, there's an awful lot of focus these days on using music in particular for medical purposes. The risk factors, obviously, as we were saying earlier, as I was saying, the connection between body and brain is so intimate that any kind of illness that you have is going to compromise your brain ultimately. Diabetes, obesity, metabolic syndrome, all of them are very bad for your brain. Some scientists even call diabetes, type 2 diabetes, the third type of Alzheimer's. But it's certainly, there are many connections between diabetes and dementia. So you need to take care of yourself. The protective factors are obviously to take good care of yourself, to prevent as much as you can, to get diagnosed as quickly as you can, to do treatment if you need it, and try to cure if a cure is possible, and maintain whatever is going on. There's a great book that's just out by Nina Kraus, who is a wonderful researcher, neuroscientist, researcher in music, and she talked about, she gave a list of where music is being used in medical situations. And she talked about traumatic brain injury, for example. Music is also being used in mitigating the stress that accompanies intractable illnesses. For example, cancer patients who get stressed out about their cancer, it's the stress reduction ability of music that is making it possible for them to reduce, for example, the amount of medication that they use, or the amount of anesthesia that people need when they're having an operation. Music can mitigate memory loss in Alzheimer's. If we have time during the Q&A, and if you don't know the story of Henry, who had dementia, was in a catatonic state, put on earphones, and then woke up when he heard Cab Calloway music. It's like, it was almost miraculous. You should look it up. You can Google it and look at a YouTube video of that. Hearing and sound music strengthens language skills in children who are autistic or who are having other reading difficulties. Music can help with motor disorders. The rhythm of music is being found to somehow it connects, it synchronizes with the natural rhythms of the body and restores natural rhythms where it's been interrupted. Can mitigate hearing loss, improve speech understanding, and so on. So there's a whole range. Again, if you're not familiar with the NeuroArts Blueprint Initiative, Google it, look it up. They have a lot of information, particularly on the medical benefits of music. I want to bring music more to the fore. And there have been a number of articles recently that have said that they have found that hearing loss is the #1 risk factor for dementia and cognitive decline, which I found kind of startling. But when you think about it, it makes, it begins to make sense, because if you're not hearing well, if you're not hearing conversation, if you can't join in and participate in conversation, you become isolated. So you're missing out on that social engagement. You're not hearing information as much, so your brain is not being stimulated as much. It can contribute to loneliness. And this points out the connection between the hearing brain, the hearing of the ear, and the hearing of the brain. They work together. And when the importance of hearing aids, if you have hearing loss, you should be wearing hearing aids, because you need to get more sound going through the ear and up into the brain. If the brain is not hearing sound, it's going to atrophy. The whole the motor cortex and the audio cortex are going to atrophy because they're not being stimulated by sound. If that sound is muddied, and if it's not precise, that further damages the brain, because the brain is getting noisy signals and it's hearing all this noise instead of hearing, pure sounds. So you have to work both on the actual sensory mechanism and on the brain. Let me see. All right, so that's a very quick romp through brain health. And again, I hope you have questions, and we can talk about this more. Make sure that I leave time so that we have time for questions. I want to get into mental management and what I mean by mental management. Where brain health focused on the structural integrity of the brain, mental management is more a focus on the functional aspect of the brain and what the brain does. Mind is often characterized as what the brain does. It's the brain in action. And what I'm interested in here is, how do we promote quality of life? How can we use our brains, use our thinking, use the mental imagery that we have to promote quality of life? And part of that is diminishing our neuroticism, stopping thinking, ruminating about the past, obsessing about the future, causing ourselves all of this grief that is only self-generated. How do we stop doing that and instead adopt mindsets that enhance our happiness, enhance meaning and fulfillment, give us peace of mind, give us greater equanimity? And I've been struggling with this for quite a while, because there are so many different places you could go. Neuroscience is not terribly helpful in this area. So I've been looking at positive psychology and evolutionary psychology and philosophy, and even into spirituality and contemplative areas, which is a stretch for me, but it's taken me into places that I need to be. Only in the last year have I found a unifying concept that has helped me to bring this all together. And I want to share the very broad outlines of this concept with you, to see if it makes sense to you. It's based on the work of Ian McGilchrist and these two majestic books that he's written, which capture his ideas. The Master and His Emissary was written, I think, in 2009. The Matter with Things is more recent. I think it's 2022. They're both enormous books. It's a total of something like 20,000 pages of dense information. But I can honestly say that it has changed my way of looking at life. And I'm not alone in this. One reviewer of The Matter with Things said, "It's very simple. This is one of the most important books ever published." And yes, I do mean ever. That's a remarkable thing to say. And I would tend to dismiss it, except that I've read both of the books, and they are remarkable. He goes into such depth and breadth in every single topic that he talks about, and he's a polymath. He has expertise in, he started out as a literary critic, so he's grounded in the humanities. He knows all about philosophy. He was a doctor, a medical doctor. He became a neuroscientist. He knows history, anthropology. It's pretty remarkable. The core idea of all of his work is based around the idea of hemispheric lateralization. Hemispheric lateralization means or recognizes that we have two semi-independent brains in our head. And all animals, almost all animals and birds have two hemispheres in our brains. The human brain has become particularly differentiated. The two brains look at the world in very different ways. And you can understand, on one level, why that would cause us confusion, because we have two brains, and if they start disagreeing with each other, then we're arguing with each other. That can't be helpful. This all started, by the way, back with split brain research that Roger Sperry and Michael Gazzaniga started. You may have heard this. They were trying to treat intractable epilepsy, and they or whoever did this came on this radical idea of cutting the corpus callosum, which is the band right in the middle that connects the two hemispheres, cutting them so that you had the signals of the epilepsy were not bouncing back and forth between both hemispheres. And it worked. It made it helped diminish the epilepsy. But once people had their brains separated as two separate brains, and the communication was severed, that enabled scientists to be able to use techniques of just accessing one brain, like just accessing the right hemisphere, and understanding how it behaved and how that differed from the left hemisphere. Now, this whole area fell into disrepute because it was taken over by the popular imagination. And, the right hemisphere is the creative brain and the left hemisphere is the logical brain. And there are elements of truth in that, but it became so trivialized and distorted that serious scientists backed away from it. But the science continued, and Ian McGilchrist continued to monitor the science, really absorb it, really figure out the implications, and connects it to what is going on in society. How does society and culture reflect these two perspectives? And how in turn does the way culture has progressed affect the way our two hemispheres operate? Very quickly, what McGilchrist says is healthy is a collaborative flow back and forth. We have these two brains because two brains are better than one, and it allows us to do two different types of things, and that makes us more powerful. But it has to be in a collaboration. The right hemisphere tends to take in new information and get a holistic view, a realistic view of what's going on with life. Then when it needs an analysis of certain things, it passes it over to the left hemisphere. The left hemisphere does its analysis, and then it should pass it back to the right hemisphere to take those concepts, that analysis, those details, those routines, and work them back into the big picture, into the context, the big gestalt of actual lived experience. What happens when we get muddled is that the left hemisphere takes over and interrupts the cooperation. The left hemisphere says, no, I've got it. I don't need the right hemisphere anymore. I've figured it out. Now, if you consider that it's the right hemisphere that is grounded in reality and the left hemisphere that is grounded in concepts of reality, ideas about reality, not reality, but ideas about reality, and concepts that may be logical, but they adhere to their own internal logic, not necessarily to the logic of reality and of direct experience, you can see why this can be problematic, because this is when we go off and when we hear this, the voices in our heads telling us all of these crazy things about, well, we should have done this, and why didn't we do that? And Jane doesn't like me, and she hates me, and I'm a failure. And, all of this stuff is a product of the conceptual left hemisphere that has failed to take it back to the right hemisphere and say, really? Is this really what is going on? Let's look at this more realistically. So very quickly, the antidote, the way that, this makes sense to me now as a mind management technique. And again, we're not trying to address major psychoses here. It's the muddles that we get ourselves into, the neuroses, the self-talk and so on. But it follows the same pattern that we established in brain health. It's a risk and protections. We want to lower the risks and we want to ramp up the protections. And what this means in terms of mental balance is we want to restore that collaborative flow from right to left, back to the right, which means we really need to ramp up right hemisphere modes because they have been suppressed, and pull back on left hemisphere modes. It's a long way around to getting to music, but music is perfect for doing this. McGilchrist says music is the language of the right hemisphere. And music and language use all parts of our brain. Language is mostly the domain of the left hemisphere. The left hemisphere is more engaged in the processing of spoken language and written language and reading. But the right brain plays its role. The left brain does not really understand metaphor and does not really understand prosody, the poetry of language. That is the function of the right hemisphere. But so music, which is the language of the right hemisphere, part of the reason that it helps us ground ourselves in the right hemisphere is it is really grounded in the present. It's like mindfulness is an important part of right hemisphere thinking. We experience music in the present moment. We can have a concept of the past, but that's concept. Concept of the future, that's concept. Direct experience of a music keeps us in the present. It flows across time. The left hemisphere doesn't like flow. It wants to break things into little pieces and stabilize them because it wants to understand it and understand how we can use things, how we can exploit things. And it's hard to understand stuff when it's constantly changing. The right hemisphere is perfectly happy with change. That's what life is about, is change. Music is all about change. A single note is not music. It's the relationship between the music, between the notes. It's the betweenness, as McGilchrist likes to say, the exchange, the interaction between elements across time that is, dynamic and makes it important. Music brings us to the right hemisphere because it's holistic. It has its own meaning. You don't necessarily, we can ask what's the meaning of the music, but that's, probably not the best way to deal with it. The music is its own meaning. Your singing is its own meaning. One of the things that happens with right hemisphere activities that grounds you in the right is this feeling of awe. The wonder and awe. It's this transcendent feeling when you look at things like Dr. Keltner is a psychologist who works at the University of Berkeley, and he has a new book called, I forget what it's that, but it's about awe. and he talks about the 8 wonders of awe. Different areas that his research has shown evoke this feeling of awe. And it's things like human bravery and compassion, natural beauty, group synchronicity, epiphanies, life, death, mysticism, psychedelics, and music is very much one of these things that can create this feeling of awe, makes the hair stand on our heads. Feelings of awe have these characteristics of being transcendent. They give us the feeling of unity with something grander than ourselves. And this also has the effect of creating a sense of humility. It's a diminution of our sense of self, not in a negative way, but it puts us into perspective. We're not so egocentric. We're not so self-centered. We are connected to this broader, magnificent whatever it is. If you're religious, you believe in God, it's a connection to God. If you're, more secular, it's a connection to nature. The right hemisphere embraces mystery. The left hemisphere can't stand mystery. It refuses to deal with anything that it can't solve. I've never been to Red Rocks, but just looking at this picture and from what I hear about listening to a concert in the Southwest, in this magnificent, awesome landscape with these awesome rock structures, the awesome music, the awesome feeling of all of these thousands of people synchronized to the sound must be just a really transcendent experience. And finally, just let me say that, music is our way of playing and of being joyful and of celebrating the wonders and mysteries of life. We learn so much when we're young through play. It's the, more and more educators are saying we just need to let kids play more because that's how they really learn. And as we get older, we tend not to play as much. I think that art is adult play. It's our excuse to play. So music and singing is our way to be joyful, to learn more about how sound can energize our brain, make us healthier. But really, one final point, evolution has programmed our brain to find pleasure in things that are good for us. So you should pay attention to when you're being joyful. And I hope that all of you are joyful when you are singing, when you're participating with encore creativity in the singing. With that, let me end. Let me just repeat sort of the main points to possibly it'll stimulate some of your questions. Music is organized sound. Sound is energy. Organized energy affects the plasticity of our brain in positive ways. So music and sound are fundamental to our ability to live well and to navigate our soundscape. The behavioral roots of brain health, these 8 areas that we found, if you can ramp up the protective factors and lower the risk factors on all of them, it puts you in the best position to live a long life and to live a healthy life. And music can play an important role in many of these, if not all of them. And then finally, in terms of the hemispheric balance, because modern culture has so emphasized left hemisphere roots, it's unbalanced our brain. We need to do a lot more activities that connect us to the right hemisphere, and music, I believe, does that. So I'm going to stop there. And Brian, maybe you can bring us back wherever we want to be.
Absolutely. I think if you stop sharing, Michael, we can come back to kind of a gallery mode.
Great.
And we have quite a few comments in the chat. First of all, Michael, thank you for
Yeah, of
a
course.
very interesting presentation. We're so
Brian,
glad that you're able to be here with us this evening.
can you indulge me for a minute? I need to take a bio break.
Absolutely.
I'll be right back.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Well, let's take these few moments that Michael's given us to take a look at the chat function. If you have any questions about any of the questions that Michael presented during his presentation, go ahead and use that chat and pop your ideas, your questions in. And again, I'd reference everyone to go back to the chat and check out the Google Drive link that I put in. That will take you to the handout that Michael suggested we review as a supplement to his presentation this evening.
Brian, I'll just mention, hi everyone, this is Joshua. Thanks for joining us again tonight. We're excited about this conversation because we are about to embark, as we've shared a little bit about and we'll be sharing more about, on a research project with AARP to kind of revitalize the conversations and the research that began back in 2001 that Michael was referencing. We're going to be forming a health and well-being and research committee. There are several people I know who are on here tonight. One of those being Dr. Sandra Quinn and Dr. Martha Dinkla. And I'll just mention Martha put in a couple of great comments here. You know, as a retired cognitive neurologist, I'd like to add that performing music engages both sides of the cerebral hemispheres and enhances interhemispheric connectivity in the developing brain, but singing most of all because of the words involved is the most enhancing of getting both sides of the brain to work and play together. Also, reception and perception of musical pitch is grounded in right brain performance as motor output requires a sequencing over time that's programmed in the left brain. Just lots of good conversations here, and I love this conversation because Brian and I both, you know, as artists, but also as administrative leaders, we always hear the left and right brain conversation. Are you left brain? Are you right brain? And so it's neat to hear tonight, Michael, you start to kind of break some of that down for us.
Yeah, I didn't catch all of what you were saying, but I think the point that I've heard is you're not left brain, or you're both brain. I mean, you use both of your brains. It's just that the perspective of the left brain tends to get precedence in modern cultures. At least that's McGilchrist's thesis, and he does a very convincing job to me, you know, of laying out the evidence for that.
So, Michael, I've encouraged our members who are on the call, who, as you left, were all applauding because I think they really enjoyed your presentation. I have a list of some questions that they would like to ask. Is it okay if I start reading you a couple of these questions and then you can answer in your time?
Of course.
All right. So the first question is from Joan. Have you looked at the benefit of organized sound and music specifically for folks with traumatic brain injury?
I have not, but that was one of the areas that Nina Kraus, you know, mentioned specifically. I mean, I'm not a research scientist, so whatever I would do would be reading the research of people. She has a website, and I will try to find it for you. She would be a good source to try to find out. Well, I'll get that to you. But if you Google Nina Kraus, she's at Northwestern University. I think she would be able to hook you into whatever research there is on traumatic brain injury, and also the Neuro Arts Initiative. They're looking at all of the medical, you know, effects of organized music. So I'm sure that they would use traumatic brain injury. I know that, you know, Kraus talks about concussion and sports as being very bad for the brain. And we know that it's bad for the brain. Partly it's because it interrupts your hearing and makes it harder for you to hear. So, and they are, you know, they're all connected.
Thanks, Michael. For everyone, I just put into the chat a link to Nina Kraus's landing page as part of the Northwestern School of Communication. So
Yeah,
you can
something
find
like
information about her.
brain volts, or it might be brain volts is, her more specific area. I'm sorry I didn't
Sure.
have that.
No, that's okay. I'm going to head back up into the chat. And I had a question, several questions actually, about the efficacy, in your opinion, the efficacy of kind of the brain building apps, whether they're games or Sudoku or Wordle, the New York Times Wordle. What are your feelings on those and their ability to kind of repair, restore, make resilient the human brain?
That's a great question. When I was in running the Staying Sharp program at AERP, I got visits from all of these guys, everybody who had an app, because they wanted AERP's endorsement, and I resisted giving the endorsement to any of them. Some of them are much better than others. There's a guy named Michael Merzenich, who was a real pioneer in brain plasticity. And he has developed a brain health program that actually works specifically on hearing and sound. And essentially, if you play sounds over and over again, or specific frequencies, the brain will get attuned to it and get better at that. And his program ramps up the difficulty, each time as it goes forward. His programs are better than the others, and they really do research to, base what they're doing on the research. Most of the others, I think, are limited in their value. Anything that you exercise over and over and over again is going to get better. But one of the things I hope I made clear is that you need to stimulate your whole brain. You can't just stimulate one part of it and hope that it, the whole brain will get better. Music has this impact of, getting more areas, but doing something like word games will only practice and exercise that part of your brain. It leaves the rest of the brain, not being exercised. Excuse me. So any of these programs that say do this and your brain health is solved, is misleading, because you're ignoring a lot of the other things. Doing crossword puzzles is great. I love doing crossword puzzles. It's, it stimulates a lot of different things, but it's not the solution to brain health. I also have to eat properly. I also, have to exercise. And I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, there's a bit of a follow-on question in the same vein. Does art or visual art impact the brain the same way that music making does, engaging with the sonic world?
Well, I don't know that it engages with the sonic world. That's an interesting question. I mean, obviously, it's different sensory mechanism. There is interesting, Nina Kraus, I think, was talking about hearing and sight are intimately connected. When we look at something, what we hear in association with what we see will change what we see, and vice versa. We can be hearing something, and if we're shown a picture that, is something other than what we thought it was, we will tend to think, oh, it's more what I'm looking at. So there is connection between the brain, the visual brain and the auditory brain. This also raises another question, which is not exactly what was being asked, but I think it's important, is the difference between being an audience member and being an actual maker of art. Looking at a picture will certainly stimulate ideas, depending upon, how much you get connected to what's being stimulated. But the making of art, the actual process of trying to put paint on canvas or to draw is going to be more stimulating to your brain. And I think it's the same with music. Well, I know it's the same with music. Nina Kraus has done, research on this, that professional musicians, for example, have much greater acuity, auditory acuity than non-professional musicians because they're listening carefully for their whole lives. So when they get into a situation when they're older of trying to hear an individual voice in a crowded room, professional musicians do a much better job because all of their auditory acuity has been heightened through the practice of music. You don't get quite that same boost from listening to music, although it depends upon, also how you are listening to music. If you're listening to music mindfully and carefully and really listening, for the nuances in the timbre and the subtlety of the rhythms and so on, you're going to be more stimulated than if you're just using it as background, fill.
Thanks, Michael.
Yeah.
A couple important links are in the chat now. Ingrid was kind enough to place the Brain Volt link from Northwestern. That's
Thank you,
chat.
Brain Volt. Yes, thank you so much.
And Dr. Sandra Quinn popped in a bit of information about Renee Fleming and others talking about the NeuroArts Blueprint, and that's a Kennedy Center link in the chat as well. And Michael, quite a few of our singers have mentioned this in the chat, that they loved the presentation and were taking notes. And as you moved through the slides, they didn't get to finish taking notes on some of the slides. So is this a presentation you'd be comfortable sharing with our membership at some point?
Sure. You have a recording, so they can review the recording, right?
We do. They're particularly interested in the charts in particular, the diagrams of the brain, for example.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, they can, would a copy of the slides be useful? I mean, if I make that of it. Okay. The other thing is I sort of obsessively wrote out everything that I wanted to say. So I have a 10-page script, not that I followed it, but I have a 10-page script that I can share if people are, interested in reading. I try to write full sentences.
I would imagine that they would love seeing that, Michael, and we can pop that up on the singer side of our Encore Creativity website.
Okay, so if I share that with you, then you can distribute it.
Yeah.
The other thing you can do is, contact me at patterson0913@gmail.com.
I'm going to put that in the chat for you. That's Patterson.
Yeah, Patterson 0913@gmail.com. Yeah, and I will send you whatever you want. I have a weekly newsletter that I send out, not specifically about music, but about brain health and mental management. And I'm going to feature music this week. You can also go to my website, which is mindramp.org, and sign up for the newsletter there. As I think Brian mentioned, I also have a podcast that I produce, and you can get that through the website, or that's probably the easiest way, is just go to the website and there's a link there that takes you to the platform. Or if you look for MindRamp podcasts, it's theoretically on, wherever you normally get your podcasts.
Sure. Well, we have a few more questions for you, Michael, before we wrap up tonight. And I'll just say you're a brave soul putting your email address out there, because there are about 8 folks on this call, and we have 1,300 singers at Encore Creativity. So you might be getting.
I take it back. No, no, it's great.
There's a question above asking about the app that you recommend for hearing and sound. You think you referenced a hearing and sound app, and if you have that easily recallable and would let us know what that is.
I forget what it's called, and I think it's called something different than it was when I, really was intimate with it. But I'll research that and get that information to you, Brian and Joshua, so you can share it.
Wonderful.
Okay.
Karen Tommen asks, music seems an entire brain exercise. If music is organized sound, wouldn't not the left hemisphere also be involved, since organization is the domain of that hemisphere?
Yeah, it is very much, and that's a terrific point to bring up. Going back to one of the initial statements, we use our entire brain for everything that we do, for the most part. I mean, you can't really separate them. Yeah, I would think that, if you're, for example, analyzing a score, and you read music and you're learning a score, that's going to be very similar to reading text, which is, a left hemisphere activity. One of the points that McGilchrist makes about the two hemispheres is that it's not so much what they do, it's how they do it that is very differently. Both sides will process music. The left hemisphere is the one that is probably going to break it into bits and pieces, try to figure out the concepts. So this is an integral phrase followed by another integral phrase. The left hemisphere likes breaking things up for analysis. The right hemisphere is the one that puts it all together in a more holistic, flowing way. So when you're singing, or when you're learning, let me take it back to that side. When you're learning, it may well be very useful for the left hemisphere to be engaged, because you need to take one little piece at a time and really figure it out. But then once you practice and once you really start singing, it's got to be the right hemisphere that puts it all together in a seamless manner. It's sort of like your golf swing or practicing foul shots. If you think too much about it, you're thinking with your left hemisphere, and then you can't do it. You have to let your intuitive sense just, go with what you've learned and feel free. I should ask you, who are the musicians, does that ring true, that you need to sort of stop the analysis at some point and go with the flow of the feeling?
I'm seeing some nodding heads. We have a couple comments from our doctors.
Yes.
Martha, anyone interested in a follow-up Zoom conversation about this can reach out. Martha would be happy to continue the conversation about research on the brain and music. And Kendra, you're a sophisticated consumer of research. What research questions are most interesting to you with regard to music and health?
Was that a question to me?
That was to you, Michael.
Oh, I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
What research questions are most interesting to you with regard to music and health?
Well, what people are looking for, and I'm hesitating because this is a very left hemisphere sort of orientation, but we're looking for, what are the mechanisms? Intuitively, experientially, we say people look happier. They report that they are healthier, and they have more energy. But what conceivably are the biological mechanisms that could make that happen? And that type of research seems to be the type of research that is more compelling to funders and more compelling to administrators who are trying to decide, should I keep this program? Should I not keep this program? So if we can find the biological, the physiological, the neurological mechanisms whereby music actually improves health metrics and things that are measurable. Again, this is a left hemisphere preference, wants to measure everything, but that's where our culture is. we want to be able to measure things. So quantifiable evidence, not just saying I feel better, but how do you quantify feeling better? That's a challenge right there, but how do you quantify it? And can you actually, in a controlled, clinical trial where you have what you're testing and you have a real control group that's doing something equivalent, but different, do you actually see measurable results because of the music intervention?
Ingrid popped another link into the chat here, AARP Staying Sharp, and there's the link. She said this link has many interesting sections. And Michael, if you were to click this link, which sections would you recommend to users? Perhaps that's something you can review and provide us after the call, unless you're already familiar with things.
I have to admit that I can take no credit for this version of Staying Sharp, nor any blame for this version of Staying Sharp. It's an entirely new group, and they take an entirely new approach. I think there is still a relationship with the Dana Alliance for Brain Initiatives, which is a nonprofit organization. I'm going off on a bit of a tangent, but it's another resource for people. The Dana Alliance for Brain Initiatives works with the top neuroscientists in the country who have made a commitment to talk about their research in plain language. And they supplied the neuroscientists for me, when we were doing these moderated discussions. I think they are still partnering with AARP. They have their own wonderful website at dana.org. And you can find out a lot of stuff about brain health, not necessarily specific to music, but general brain health information. They publish a lot of very good books, again, that are written in plain language that are accessible about brain health.
That's great, Michael. Well, I want to say thank you for your time tonight, Michael. Do you have any parting words of wisdom for us as we come to a close tonight?
Well, I'm delighted to sort of, to be invited. As I said, I met Jean Kelly and was involved with Encore Chorale early on, and I knew that she had left, and then it was a delight to meet Joshua and see what he's done in expanding everything, and to meet Brian. And it seems like you're growing in leaps and bounds and expanding what you're doing with the university. So it's exactly what I had always hoped would happen with the creative aging movement, is that organizations like Encore Creativity would continue to be vibrant and to continue to give opportunity to people to engage in meaningful professional-led, arts programs, because art is wonderful and brains are wonderful, and they make a wonderful match together.
Well, thank you, Mike. This has been a fascinating presentation. If you send me those slides, I can certainly get them up for our membership. And just a reminder to everyone on the call, all of these are recorded and all are available on demand. And you can find those recordings after registration on the private side of our website. So thank you so much, Michael, for your time and for joining us this evening in our latest installment of our Masterclass series.
Thank you so much. Thank you for everybody for listening and great questions.
Thank you.
Have a fabulous night, everybody.